Welcome everyone to today's WeCo webinar learning series on the technical guidance for the Americans with Disabilities Act web rules. My name is Lynn Wehrman. I'm president founder here at WeCo, and we've already given a couple of great webinars that you've been really receptive of. We've gotten great feedback from everyone. Um, and I'm just checking as people are coming in here. But we've gotten great feedback from everyone, particularly because we dug down into which documents do we need to make accessible and which are the exceptions for the ADA web rules. Well, today you're in for a real treat because we're bringing in our lead accessibility specialist, Tyler Malone, to present the next steps. This is actually our technical guidance webinar on the ADA to give you a good start on the things that you need to change in an existing website or plan for in a website that you're building to make sure that you conform to the ADA web rules. Next slide. Okay, and without further ado, I am going to introduce you to your instructor, Tyler Malone. Tyler is a really remarkable person who came to us almost 3 years ago now as an intern. He had done some really interesting accessibility work on the website of the university that he attended when he discovered that it was not accessible. He's a native screen reader user. He is blind. We're also really excited because Tyler is going to be in the Twin Cities this spring. Just for those of you who are our clients and our supporters in the Twin City area, he is going to be co-teaching with me the League of Minnesota Cities statewide accessibility workshops. He'll be doing the last two, one in April, one in May. And he is going to be coming back to teach at Open Source North at St. Thomas, and I cannot remember the date that is. So we're really glad that we're going to have him in person. Reach out to us if you want to meet Tyler. I think we're going to get a bunch of clients and supporters together for drinks at some point, but we'd love to have you actually meet him in person. So without further ado, Tyler, I'll just have you take over. Or
All right.
do you want me to do the explanation about the company
Oh,
part?
sure. Yeah, you can do that one.
Okay. Sorry, guys. I just kind of stepped into this after a busy day, a little less polished than I'd like. A little bit about who we are. Digital Accessibility by WeCo. We are a consulting group of digital accessibility professionals, and we all live with disabilities. We're a little different than most companies that do this. We believe that disability is actually a skill set. So, in order to be an accessibility specialist like Tyler is, or one of our remote usability testers, you have to live with a disability. You have to bring that skill set to the table. So, what we specialize in is putting you in direct touch with knowledgeable professionals who live with disabilities. We are members of the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and our specialists are all required to have at least the web development web accessibility specialist or WAS certification. We have a growing number of our specialists that also have the core competencies or CPAC. For those of you who know what those are, next slide. Okay, and this is where you take over, Tyler.
Yep. All right. In today's webinar, we're going to talk about what Title II is and who it applies to, the accessibility and user impacts of both Title II and the new web rules, what the WCAG is, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We're going to talk a little bit about what you're going to want to fix first to have the greatest improvement of accessibility. And we're going to talk about some planning and processes considerations. So this will be, how do I actually make this happen? And then we'll end with some questions, and we have a few resources to throw out for your consideration as well. And on this slide, we have an open laptop with a cityscape visible in the background. Next slide. All right, so we're going to start by talking about what Title II actually is. On this slide, we have an image of a young person with long hair navigating through a doorway in a wheelchair. Oh, sorry, in a market area. I skimmed too quickly. So, Title II is about civil rights inclusion. It means that states and local governments need to make services and products accessible. We like to look at this more of a tool for inclusion rather than a legal requirement. Don't get me wrong, it is legally required, but this is about enhancing the accessibility of everything for citizens. This isn't about forcing you to conform to a regulation. Regulations are a way of formalizing it. And so we want to talk about how that formalization comes into practice to benefit users. Next slide. This slide has a person sitting at a mobile desk using a mobile phone, and their hand is attached to their shoulder. So on April 24th, 2024, the Federal Registration published the DOJ, Department of Justice's updated regulations for Title II of the Adults with Disabilities Act. The final rule includes specific requirements that apply both to websites and to mobile applications. That's the apps that we all use every day to make sure that content is accessible to everyone with disabilities. Next slide. So now we have a table being displayed that shows the compliance date for these regulations varying according to the size of the population that your government entity serves, or the type of government entity. So we have below 50,000 is April 26th of 2027, sorry. Special district governments is April 26th, 2027. 50,000 or more people is April 24, 2026. So that's next year, about a year right from now. And we're going to go to the next slide now. All right. So in this one, we have some smart art that displays different ways people with disabilities interact digitally and some of the development needs that allow us to interact and access information. People with blindness and low vision rely upon properly marked navigation points. So this is semantic structure given to your website using HTML native tags and data applied through things like ARIA attributes and roles. This helps a blind person navigate the page, understand where they are, understand what information is there, and the relationship between pieces of information. So we like to use headings as a really good example of this, where someone using a screen reader might want to understand what kind of information is on the page by having a list of headings read out to them by the screen reader. So they're going to use a shortcut key. It's going to pull up a list of the headings on the page, and they can go, all right, heading one, this page is about services in the area. And then we have heading two might be parks. There might be another heading two that's support services. So we can tell from that structure, okay, these are the topics on the page. Those need to be marked semantically so that a screen reader can identify the code and tell the user what's actually there. And that helps us look for the information on the page without having to read the entire page, the same way that you might sweep your eye across and look for things that are visually styled to help you understand what's on there. And people who are deaf or hard of hearing might rely on captions within video content. Transcripts also give people with multiple disabilities options to understand the content of a video. So captions are going to mark all of the sounds in the video, not just what people are saying, but also sound effects in the area, music that might be dubbed over, all that sort of thing. Transcripts will be a description. Sometimes if we do simple transcripts, we're looking at copies of just the same thing. We're looking at speech, we're looking at sound effects. We might have a descriptive transcript, which includes visual information. Similar to if anyone's ever watched a video with audio description, all of that information, what the actors are doing, what they're interacting with, what actions are carried out by them, and also the sounds in addition, all in the context described in the same order that it appears in the video. Sign language can also additionally be a huge boon for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, especially if you were born learning sign language before English. You would technically consider English a second language in that case. So it's very, very important to keep in mind that sign language is not just a preference, but a need for a lot of users who are hard of hearing, who are born hard of hearing, or entered that culture early in their life. People with limited fine motor skills might need things like search boxes, larger touch targets or click targets for links, easy to interact with drop downs, or animations that are a little more stable that don't move around. Anything that requires less control of a pointer that makes it easier to interact with the screen, with the interface, without having to move a pointer around or do a bunch of control using keys is always going to be better. A good recommendation we make for people who want to really understand how someone with motor disabilities lives, unplug your mouse, just use your keyboard, and if you can if you can't do something on your website, then they're probably not going to be able to do it either. Everything needs to be interactable through the keyboard. And low vision users are also only using the keyboard in a lot of cases. So this is hugely important to make sure that we can click on things, make sure those touch target, click targets are large, make sure that things aren't moving around, make sure that controls are easy to activate with keyboard and mouse, not just one or the other. And finally, people with cognitive disabilities rely on clear, concise, plain language, well-organized content, low distractions. So we don't want to see any of those flashing animations, trying to do advertisements on the sidebar or the banner. Reducing motion can help with people who get nausea from motion. Making sure that when we're using emojis and emoticons, that we're also conveying what the meaning behind them are, so that we're not relying on somebody to understand symbols they might not be familiar with or able to recognize. There are a lot of considerations that go into this. We don't want to distract people. We don't want to have dense blocks of text because that can be stressful and it can be hard to read. We want to be considerate of people who might have cognitive disabilities that make it hard to read text, who need more spacing or more negative space in order to follow lines. We also want to be considerate of people who might have epilepsy, who can be triggered by flashing graphics. All right, next slide. Okay, so what is the WCAG? Um, so the WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the WCAG is a set of standards that was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. There are strong recommendations that are widely applicable across different technologies. So this is websites, mobile apps, they have applications for kiosks. It is designed to be technology agnostic. You should be able to broadly apply these to pretty much any technology that you're servicing inside your area of focus. And what these do is they standardize expectations across the industry to make sure that everything is accessible to everyone who needs to access it. We have three levels that we look at in the WCAG. We have level A, which is minimum expectations for accessibility. We have double A, which is the industry gold standard. It's minimum expectations have been met and additional tweaks and improvements have been made. This is what we target most of the time. We also have AAA, AAA, which is kind of a best case scenario wish list. We understand that these are complicated or might not have actual solvable ways to implement, but if you can get this behavior to replicate across your website, this would be fantastic. It'll make everyone happy. The goal is always meet AAA if you can, but AA is realistic. That's the realistic expectation. And in fact, the ADA Title II, Section 508 requires that you meet WCAG 2.1 level AA. Now, 2.1 is the adopted standard because it is mature, it's been tested in the field. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. WCAG 2.1 is now the previous standard. W3C released WCAG 2.2 last year, which is what a lot of private companies are now targeting because it's an improved standard. It's been cleaned up a little bit. It has additional considerations that add benefits. But if you're a government entity, for the most part, you're going to be targeting WCAG 2.1 level AA within the United States. So the DOJ adopted WCAG 2.1 level AA because it's already well known. We've been using it for quite a few years in the private sector, and the government has been using it in coordination with the requirements for Section 508. So this has been broadly applicable for a long time. Developers have had a lot of time to put their hands on it, to test it, to build implementations. Anyone who looks through GitHub is going to see a lot of recommended components that improve accessibility for a lot of different programs and software. It's it's time tested, we have developed regulations, and we have enough of an understanding that there isn't a high learning curve for adopting. So this ensures that as we're working with vendors, as we're hiring contractors, as we're trying to implement this, that if you look something up for documentation, you're actually going to be able to find guides on what you need. That it doesn't, it sets a high bar, but it sets a reasonable bar. And this slide shows an image of the W3C logo. All right, we're going to move on to the next slide now. Okay, so we're going to talk about what you should fix first. We're going to go over some basics that are going to be helpful. These are the kinds of things that we run into every day when we're doing testing for clients. These are the kinds of things that improve your website or software accessibility the most. So we're going to give you kind of a quick list of, hey, when someone gets on your website, the question we ask is, when we're testing is, what are we here to do? What is trying to be accomplished here? A lot of the time, we want to navigate something, we want to access some information. So these guidelines and recommendations are kind of designed to fit around that. Now we're going to go to the next slide. All right, so on this slide, we're showing the navigation menu on the ada.gov, and we have a menu expanded to show the submenu. So we're going to talk about creating navigation points first. Navigation points are super important. This is primarily focused on navigation, but there are some considerations for in your main content area as well. So global navigation is a big consideration. That's why the picture is what it is. One of the biggest issues we come across, most common issues we come across, is trying to access the submenus for the global navigation, and you can expand it via a mouse pointer, but you cannot expand it with a keyboard. A lot of the time what we see is that we have an event listener, you hover the pointer over, it pops that menu out. When you hover back off it, it disappears. If you're only using a keyboard, that's not going to work because you can't tab in and get that to expand. So we want a universal event listener. We want on focus, not on hover. We need to be able to detect when somebody's trying to navigate via keyboard. We also want to make sure that we have the ability to control expand and collapse for the submenu. So big consideration here is we want to make sure that we're telling assistive technology where they are on the page. We need to have landmarks. We're using the less NAV greater tag to identify the primary landmark. That's usually global navigation. That's your bar across the top. Sometimes it's down the left side. And if we're doing secondary navigation, we want to use a less nav tag as well. And we want to make sure we're using ARIA titles, ARIA labels on those navigation landmarks to identify which navigation is which. So for that, we go less NAV, ARIA label equals primary navigation, global navigation, something like that. On our secondary navigation, less nav, ARIA label equals secondary navigation. If it's specific to a function on the website, you can also name it something like blog articles or primary site navigation and secondary site navigation, such and such a service. It's as long as it's articulate and clear, as long as it makes sense in the context, understand what links are being listed there. That's what we're looking for. It's also helpful if it's concise. We're shooting for, 3 to 5 words. We don't want to be too robust because someone's going to have to listen to that multiple times, and they might have to listen to a long string of words. It might be a little confusing. So we're also going to want to use ARIA to convey when a submenu is expanded. I just talked about that. We're looking for control to expand and collapse the submenu. It's also important to tell the user that it's expanded or collapsed. So the way we do that, we go in the submenu, we go on that button that's controlling the expand and collapse, and we're going to go ahead and put an ARIA expanded attribute in there. We're going to control it with JavaScript so that when I hit that button to expand the submenu, I've got my submenu open. We do a JavaScript call. We change the value inside ARIA expanded from false to true. And then on my side with the screen reader, what I'm hearing is submenu button expanded. And when I hit it to close it, submenu button collapsed. And then I know, okay, if I hit expanded, I know it's open. I know I can tab through. If I collapse it, I know it's collapsed. And if I hit tab, I'm going to the next submenu button. So that's super important for understanding. We're already adding a huge amount of accessibility that's missing from, I would say, most websites at this point, just by doing these little tweaks. And so the last thing to highlight here is just we want to make sure that for controlling the submenu expand and collapse, we're not using the top level link. So if we have a list of links that's under a certain category and it has a landing page, so say we have blog and then we have a list of different article categories, the blog link that goes to the blog landing page should not be also expanding and collapsing the submenu. We want a button to the side that triggers that expand collapse, or we just want to change that link to be a button so that we're putting the first thing we're putting focus on to control the submenu is a button, is a control that we can activate to expand and collapse. All right, we're going to move to the next slide now. And I know I'm going over a lot of detailed technical information. I do want to throw out when we've worked through this, we do have a spot for questions at the end. You're also free to throw comments or questions into chat, and Lynn and Ellen will watch for those and interrupt me if needed to answer any topical questions. So feel free to take notes, feel free to ask questions. The next thing we're going to talk about is alt text for graphics. On this slide, we have an example of some simple alternative text. So we have a chocolate cake, and the alt text for this might be a chocolate cake on a platter. And that's a good generic description. And it gets at the first point we're going to talk about, which is decorative versus meaningful. So for decorative images, we don't want alt text. I know that can be a little counterintuitive. There's a lot of advice out there. A lot of people do prefer alt text more than not having alt text. In general, we like to recommend if you have a reason to put an image on the page, it's probably meaningful. It's probably conveying something in the context of your page. If your page is about a park inside your district and the content on the page is about features of the park and those features are displayed in the image, I would lean towards saying go ahead and describe it. Put maybe 100 to 200 characters in there. Try and write something short and snappy that just says, you know, a picture of XYZ Park by the lake with the boat dock in the distance and the visitor center in the front right. That way we know what's in the image, what things are going to be talked about, all that sort of stuff. If it's decorative and it doesn't, you think it's just a pretty picture and it doesn't really mean that much, and the information is provided elsewhere on the page, you can mark it decorative. That's not as big of a deal. It's important to consider that for SEO purposes, sometimes SEO does prefer you to have alt text. So it can be better to lean towards having alt text. And I know a lot of people in the blind community do prefer alt text over not having alt text, even if it is arguably decorative. Where we want to straddle a fine line where we don't want to have everything have alt text because sometimes you just don't need to say something. Images that are purely decorative don't really matter in the context of trying to get information off a page. So it's a bit more of an art than it is a science. The important focus area is just we want to make sure if something is meaningful, if you're putting information into an image or referring to the image in the text, or if it's a graphic that displays some kind of data, you do need alt text. So describing images and simple graphics, as I just said, is a bit of an art. We want to make sure that we're describing what needs to be known, not necessarily everything. So if you're showing a picture of the people in your department, you don't want to say a picture of Mandy, the director of the department. You want to say what Mandy looks like. You want to say they're wearing a agency branded shirt, they have shoulder length brown hair and blue eyes, they're smiling into the camera, stuff like that. Something if I need to tell somebody what they look like when I get in the office because I have an appointment, I need to know what they look like, not that they exist and that there's a picture of them on the website. So we want to have an eye towards describing the important details, but we also don't want to describe all the details. We don't need to say necessarily in the background is a window. Through the window, you can see some trees. The trees have orange leaves. Some of the leaves have fallen. The bark has been chipped off in some places. We don't need to know that because the point of the image is to tell us this is the director, this is what they look like, this is the person you need to find. Um, so yeah, it can be a little tricky. Same thing goes with simple graphics. If we're trying to show a graphic that just does a little overview of some information, we don't necessarily need to say there's a bunch of decorative squiggles across the graphic and it has a cool logo and here's what that looks like. We want to say if it's summarizing some statistics and it's just like a little decorative frills and then the data in the middle, you just say what the data is. 50% of our served population prefer trees over grass. That's what I need to know. I don't need to necessarily know that you have cartoon trees and there's little bunnies hopping through the grass. That's fun to add, and if you can do it in a succinct way, go for it. But it's not necessary in a lot of cases. Now we get on to describing complex graphics. And this is where it gets a little tricky because if you have a graphic of text, first of all, you should not be doing that. Anything that is a complex graphic with text should be rendered programmatically as either a table or using SVG semantics. We want to build this in an accessible way to make sure that people aren't getting a really long block of alt text. There are some cases in which we do need to do this, especially with legacy software, legacy websites. So we can do some finagling. We can make this a figure with a fig caption, and that's a great way to do it. We have our fig caption that says image of XYZ data table, and then the fig caption is programmatically associated with the figure, and we can arrow through a block of text that describes exactly what's going on there. That is okay as a last resort. Better would be a table. We can have an image of the graphic for visual purposes, and then the same information in a table. Oh, I'm sorry, I had a little technical issue there. Um, we can have a complex graphic rendered as a table, and we want to make sure that we're still conveying all the same information in there. So we want to make sure that the complex graphic, all the information in there is also being given to the user to make sure that they get the same thing out of that graphic as somebody would get out of looking at it. I know I can be a little long-winded on these, so I think that's a good place to jump to the next one before I get a little too passionate. So we're going to go ahead and just go to the next slide. All right. So we're going to talk about form accessibility now. And for form accessibility, what we're looking at is we need somebody to perceive what's on the page. We also need them to be able to interact with it. And this can get a little crazy, but there are a lot of things you can do to immediately improve along the lines of navigation and alt text. You can improve a lot with a few tweaks. And these are all the kinds of things that are globally applicable. So making these best practices, adopting these across forms, or rendering these out in form templates, these can all be good ways to make sure this gets fixed. So first, we want to talk about labels and instructions. Labels are important. I think we can all agree the label tells you what to put in the form. If somebody with a screen reader, for example, doesn't hear the label when they put focus into a form field, they're not going to know what's going on. If your labels disappear when you put focus into a form field to start typing or to make a selection, someone with a cognitive disability might forget what they were supposed to type, especially if it's a long box. I mean, I think at least half of us have gotten up in the morning, filled out a form before our first coffee and gone, wait a minute, where's the label? What am I even putting in here? It's pretty broadly applicable, and it's better to just have permanent labels. A lot of people like to use the placeholder text as the label. That's a big no-no. If you really need to style your label, if you want it to appear as placeholder text, use JavaScript to pick it up and move it to the left top of the field so that it's still there, but it looks nice. You can crunch the text down a little bit so it's still visually perceivable. Keep a good font size, but you can do a lot to maintain modern styles and still have permanent labels. They're really important. And the same thing goes with instructions. We want robust instructions for complicated form fields. If there's a known selection, if they need to reference data outside the form, or if there's a lot of different pieces of information that they need to be picking, or if they need to know what the information is for to make the correct selection, we want instructions in the form field. We want them programmatically associated with the form field. So We want to make sure that we're telling them what is this information for? What should I put in here? How is this going to be processed on the server side? Because otherwise you're going to get a lot of bad entries. You're going to get issues with your error flagging. It's just a mess. So labels, we want to make sure that they're also programmatic. We want to use the for attribute. For equals ID of the form field. We want to make sure that when I put the screen reader focus into that form field, I'm hearing the name of the label and then editable. That makes sure that I understand this is the information I'm putting in. If you close your eyes and you have a screen reader on and you tab through your form, if you don't hear the label, you don't know what you're supposed to put there. So you get a lot of weird stuff going on. We also want to make sure that errors have descriptive feedback. So if I put data in and I put the wrong data in, I want either a client-side checker that flags immediately, hey, that email was in the wrong format, use this format, example, or sorry, email at example.com, that kind of thing. I want to know where the error is. So I want the text to be associated with the form field. It should be, most people put it right below. We want to make sure that it's there and that it's descriptive. Here's what you did wrong. Here's how you fix it. Here's the acceptable data to go in this field. Anything that's required, any required field should have the required attribute. Required equals true. This is very important. The screen reader, any assistive technology is going to detect that. It's going to pick it up and it's going to announce it. It's going to make sure that if my email is required, I know it's required. If I can choose email or phone number, then I'm going to know to do that. So I need to know which fields are required. We see this in a lot of cases where partial data is entered and you try to hit submit and something that's required, like some forms aren't going to require your last name. They just need a first name. But the last name was marked as required in the system and it's going to throw back even though it didn't tell you it's required. And that's going to cause some confusion and some frustration. I'm going to have to go back through the form and find what I did wrong. That's extra time. And users do not like spending extra time on web pages. We also want to make sure that any outlines for our form fields for our selects are 3:1. So this is color contrast. A lot of the time we use a dark gray color that meets a 3:1 ratio against the standard white background of most web pages. This makes sure that even when focus isn't placed on the field, I still know where the fields are. Somebody who's colorblind, who's trying to click into the form field, if it's too light gray, they might not be able to see that. And they might try clicking somewhere else and not be able to interact with the form and think it's broken. And a lot of the time, if a user thinks something's broken, they just stop using it. This also increases the rate of people reaching out to you saying, I can't use your form. And then you're like, no, it works. And there's back and forth. It takes time. Everyone's frustrated. It's better to just make sure we can all see what we're doing. And along those lines, the autocomplete attribute is also super important. Most people these days are using password and data managers. People with motor disabilities rely on them heavily so they don't have to type as much. People with visual disabilities rely on them because it's just easier and faster. People with cognitive disabilities rely on them because they might not remember all the information, or they might have trouble understanding what information goes where. So we want to have autocomplete. We want it set to the correct attribute. So if it's a password field, we want to set it autocomplete equals password. If it's email field, autocomplete equals email. It's the kind of thing that feels like an extra feature that you don't need to add, but it's a critical requirement for a lot of people who rely on that in their daily life to be able to fill out information. So in this slide, we have an image of the feedback form on the ada.gov website. And we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide now. All right, now we're going to talk about planning and processes. So we're going to talk about what you can do to plan and develop processes for maintaining accessibility. This is going to be looking at what you need to do now, what you need to be thinking about, but we also like to point out the kinds of things you need to be doing going forward once you have something implemented. Next slide. So the first thing you're going to want to do is identify your areas of responsibility. You want to ask yourself, what is my mandate? What am I supposed to do? And this isn't just what is Title II, what does Title II want me to do? This is my job title is this. My job responsibilities are this, and this is how those interact with accessibility. So this is something that can be very easy to figure out if you're a front-end developer and you're pushing stuff to prod, you know that your job is to write accessible code. If you are a manager of a department, you know that your responsibility is to make sure that your team is complying with accessibility requirements. It can also be very complicated, and that's when you reach out to WeCo, and we can also help guide you through this process. So we want to ask ourselves, what are the responsibilities of my agency? What do I need to be doing for accessibility? Which teams need support? And this can come down to which teams have the heaviest interaction with accessibility. So these are going to be developers and designers a lot of the time. Um, we want to know where we should allocate our resources the most versus the least. This slide shows an image of people putting their hands together in a team huddle formation. All right, we're going to go to the next slide now. So next, we're going to take inventory of our digital resources. So we want to ask ourselves, what are we using that is digital? How are you hosting and displaying content? What tools are you using? What third-party software are you responsible for? And so it's important to consider here, this applies to both what you use internally and what you contract out. Third-party vendors are your responsibility to make sure that they are also complying with these rules. We're the expectation is that if you hire somebody to display your content or manage your content or host your content, that is accessible as well. There isn't necessarily an exception except for legacy data that falls under other exceptions. You can't just hire someone else and make it their problem. It's still your responsibility. If you're paying for it, you're in charge of it. We're going to go to the next slide now. So it's important to also educate yourself on accessibility. You want to learn about the WCAG. We've talked a little bit about it now. There are tons of great resources about the WCAG out there. We have an e-learning platform we developed called WeCo Learning, where we have several courses that touch on the WCAG in brief. We also have an extensive course that touches on the WCAG in detail. You're going to want to look at some resources, attend some webinars, go to some conferences. You want to know what the WCAG is, what parts of it apply where. You're also going to want to learn about accessible usability. So this is an area that's getting a lot of conversation right now. We're talking about inclusivity. We want to make sure that we aren't just complying to the requirements by the letter of the law, but that we're upholding the spirit of the standards. The WCAG is designed to provide an accessible experience, and part of that is having good usability. Users living with disabilities often have the same needs that users who just benefit from good UI have. So we want to make sure that we're covering all our bases, that our interfaces are pleasant to look at, that they're easy to use, that they're streamlined, all that stuff. You also want to make sure to make yourself aware of accessibility management across your organization. So this applies more to somebody managing a program, but it also has implications for people in support roles. We want to know who we're reporting to, who's overseeing accessibility, and whose responsibility is down the chain to make sure that accessibility is identified, developed, implemented, and supported. And this slide shows an image of the W3C logo. So we're going to go to the next slide now. So now that we've looked at what our responsibilities are, what our digital resources are, we want to map out a remediation plan. And this starts by establishing scope. And a lot of the time, this is asking yourself, do I have an accessibility plan? Do I know how accessible things are? What exactly do I need to be doing? You've got your education, you're acquiring knowledge about this, you're looking at your resources, you might be looking at complaints and concerns voiced by the people you support internally and externally. You want to get a gauge of where you are. This might also include doing some audit work. You want to establish a budget. You need to understand what you have, what financial resources you have so that you know how you can address this. A lot of the time, we can't pay for huge manual audits for every single test. Sometimes we want to use a combination of automation and manual audits. That is a viable path. We do want to see human oversight on everything. We want to have users living with disabilities integrated at every level of accessibility to make sure that we're producing actual solutions, not just by the letter of the law solutions. So we want to know who we can hire, how much we can pay, what we can do to do remediation. and how it factors into your departmental budget for resources that you already have that you manage. So next, after you have your budget established, you're going to want to do audits. You want to dig in and look at the WCAG, look at what you have. Does it does it conform to the WCAG? Can the vendors you work with conform? Ask them for accessibility statements, ask them for VPATs, VPATs. Voluntary product accessibility templates are an assessment that can verify if a product is accessible, what level of accessibility it's at. You can also identify we're not accessible now, but we have a plan and we expect to be accessible by XYZ date, and this is what we're doing to implement. So if a vendor can't come up with that, that's a good sign that you either need to move on or require them to improve their accessibility. So we want to be auditing all of our technologies, checking for everything we need. Once you know what is accessible and what's not accessible, you want to create a timeline for remediation. So what we're looking at here is we want to go, all right, we our vendors have estimated that it will take them 12 months to remediate. So we're going to map out a plan. Within the next 3 months, I want to see a proposal on my desk that explains here are the things we found that are broken. Here's our plan to fix them. Here's our timeline for fixing them. And I want to see an implementation phase. I want to see a testing phase, a validation phase. I want to see scheduled out, mapped out projects that demonstrate here's where we are, here's where we need to be, here's how we're going to get there. And then we want to stick to that. We want to make sure that everyone in our department has buy-in, that we're making sure everyone's sticking to our improvement plan, and that we're double checking along the way. Because the goal is to get accessible. If we don't have a plan, if we don't have a schedule, we're not going to get there. This slide shows an image of a checklist on a clipboard with a pencil resting next to it. We're going to go to the next slide. All right, so here are our final next steps rather. So we want to prep our teams. We've got a bunch of information that we've got together at this point. We know what the WCAG is. We know who we are, what we're responsible for. We've got a good idea of remediation. We've mapped out a potential schedule. We need to get buy-in from our teams. We need to explain what the deal is to everyone, make sure everybody knows what they're responsible for. I would take the steps that we've talked about before and wrap them up and roll that out to everybody individually. So next, we want to implement changes. Everyone's on the same page. Everybody knows what they've got to do. We've got green light. We've got budget. So we're going to go in and start making changes. We're going to do our remediation based on our audits, carry through our plan. We're going to conduct reviews and updates. So we're going to be checking during the initial phases. As we go through, we're going to double check to make sure everything's accessible. And at the end of initial phase, when everything's rolled out and we think we're accessible, we're going to continue checking on a regular cadence, maybe every quarter, maybe every month, depending on the product or the service, how critical it is, who's involved, if it's legacy support. There are a lot of considerations that go into that, but we need to have consistent ongoing checks, and we need to do updates as needed to make sure we stay accessible along the way. We also want to make sure we're providing ways for users to contact us if they have complaints, if they have concerns, if they have recommendations. We're serving a community, and the community's needs are what we need to meet. So we want to make sure they have a way of talking to us and telling us what their needs are. And we want to make sure this applies maybe more for usability. We want to meet those accessibility requirements. We have a mandate to do that. We also want to make sure the way we do that again is inclusive. So bringing back in that usability perspective, we want to make sure that we're taking what our users need and how they expect to interact with our material in our sites and incorporating that in our design work. So finally, we want to make sure we're providing ongoing additional training. The WCAG changes, the rules change, the requirements change. As WCAG 2.2 becomes widely adopted, as we test it, work out the kinks and improve it, it's likely that in the future we're going to see that adopted. So we want to make sure we know what we're supposed to be doing now. New hires need to be brought up to date on accessibility. Directors and managers need to be aware of changes in the industry, changes in expectations, improvements we can do for efficiency on cost, on implementation. We want to make sure everybody knows what's going on, what they need to do. This isn't a static project. This isn't something we can roll out, release, and say, all right, we're done, we're accessible. This is should be looked at similar to risk management, to cybersecurity, ongoing education, ongoing updates, make sure that we stay on top of this in the long term. All right, we're going to go to the next slide now. So if anything we've talked about here, I know this is a lot of detailed information. If I were you at this point, if I wasn't working in this field, I'd be looking this and going, I don't know about this. This seems a little hard. WeCo's here to help. WeCo started over 10 years ago through a partnership with a law firm. We worked with users with disabilities to establish expectations, to meet requirements. All of our auditors live with disabilities, so we're coming from lived experience across the board. As far as feedback, as far as recommendations, we in a lot of the cases, we are the target audience. We are also accessibility specialists and usability specialists, which gives you the benefit of having the high level of training expertise and also the lived experience. So we're looking at, I'm not just telling you, oh, well, requirement 1.3.1 means you have to have a semantic list. I'm saying, hey, you have to have the semantic list. Here's the regulation, and this will let you conform to that so you don't get in trouble. I also want to let you know if you do this, you need to do it this way. You need to make sure that the code does this and that the screen reader says this because otherwise someone in my position is going to get confused. We're not going to know what's going on. You can code something kind of like the way you can trick a unit test into letting you pass a flag without actually doing something a lot of the time. We want to make sure that we're building good components the same way we build good unit tests. I want to make sure that when you pass with an accessible program or website, that it's because you did it right. You followed the spirit of the regulations, not just the technical requirements, not just the small stuff. Next slide. All right. So we've got about 10 minutes left, it looks like. We've got some time for questions. I know that was a lot of information. I know you're probably feeling a little overwhelmed. If you have questions, you're more than free to pop them in the chat box. You're more than free to unmute and say something, but we'll give you as much time as we can to ask any clarifications, any additional topics we didn't cover yet.
That was a lot of great information, Tyler. Thanks. I'm just kind of wondering how many people learned something that they did not know before today. Was there anything that was like earth-shattering um, or helpful? I know that we had Elizabeth put in the chat box. I want to make a recorded clip of Tyler saying using placeholder text as a label is a no-no and just put it on repeat. That can be arranged, Elizabeth. Anyone else? You could pop it into the text. We're also a small enough group. You could feel free to turn on your mic and your camera if you'd like. Anybody feeling overwhelmed after the presentation? Okay, thanks, Samantha. On an accessible PDF, would every page with the agency city logo need to have alt text, or is it okay to mark it decorative? Tyler, do we that we there's a different set of rules for documents versus websites.
Yeah. Um, I would say it depends. Um, I'm not a document specialist, so my word is not law in this area. I can give an answer as a user. I don't want to hear the logo every time I go to a new page. I want to hear it once at the beginning of the document, maybe once at the end. If it's part of your repeating header, I would make it decorative. Um, I know what document I'm in. I know the purpose of the document based on the name of the agency being included. I would, however, like to know, like I said at the beginning, if it's the first page and I'm encountering it for the first time, go ahead and include it. That's good to know. I just wouldn't want to hear that every single page. That'd get a little not overwhelming, but just repetitive. A lot of usability for screenwriters is keeping things from being repetitive because we're going to hear so much stuff.
Yeah, and in the document work that I have done too, that was not an uncommon practice. this is we actually work with another firm that does our document work. That used to be what I did. It was how I started my career out at the state of Minnesota. But we could certainly check on that for you, Samantha, and get back to you just to make sure you've got the right answer. Okay, Elizabeth, the fight of design versus accessibility is such a struggle. You've come to the right place because I have a very, very strong belief. I'm someone who is neurodiverse, and I really have a strong belief that we have to make things look good for people who are neurodiverse or who live with different cognitive disabilities. If it's not attractive, it is not going to get used. And I do not believe that something has to be ugly to be accessible. I have no time for it. It's we've worked with plenty of organizations that have made beautiful websites that are accessible. It's in my view, it's a cop out to not do accessibility work because it's absolutely not true.
Yeah, a lot of the clients that I work with on a daily basis, one of the first things I do when I'm introducing myself, when we're sizing each other up, the first thing is, so can it still be pretty? Like, yeah, of course it can. Like, come on. We're developers. We can do anything. We can add detail that's only exposed non-visually. That's the whole point of screen reader text. A lot of the time we add extra text that's connected to form fields. Those are extra instructions for someone who can't see. They're not instructions for someone who can see, and it's distracting for someone who can see. So we use the CSS to hide them. 99% of cases, good design is accessibility. It makes it more accessible, not just for people living with disabilities, but for everybody. And there's no reason something can't be beautiful and accessible besides the limitations of one's creativity.
Yeah, and I think that that's a question that comes up because that when people knew less about accessibility, people really believed that, and they had a hard time making things look good. But I do not hear that anymore from younger developers. I rarely hear that anymore. Okay. Uh, and Elizabeth said she totally agreed. Okay, then question from Sarah. I appreciate the reminder that if you are on the fence about providing alt text, it could be best to err on the side of providing it than not. Yeah.
Yep. It's that, like I said earlier, it's an art. It's very subjective. We know we need to include it. And a lot of the time it comes down to what do we actually need to include. But both are viable options. It's just based on what we're trying to communicate. We're having a conversation with our users. That's really what design is. We're saying something and we need to know what to say and how to say it effectively. And sometimes the best thing to say is nothing.
What do you mean nothing?
Oh, for decorative images.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm trying to be
sometimes.
artsy.
Is it? But yeah, and I one thing that maybe just some real life application for those of you who are struggling with documents is that we went through the process of bringing out a new proposal, and our proposal cover is has great pictures of people who live with disabilities, but we it's in a Word format because that is what is easier for our team to work in across disability types. But there was no way to be able to put all of the images as they were arranged on this cover in a way that they could be in line with text and look right. And our accessible document specialist just recommended marking them as decorative. And I think that we sometimes go down this rabbit hole of thinking that accessibility is entirely about people who are blind. But I'm a staunch defender of people with cognitive disabilities needing images because I need them. Other people I know who are neurodiverse need them. Most of us are visual learners, so it's a balance. So sometimes we are not going to be able to provide those images in certain formats. But what we want to do is make sure that the information conveyed is the same. Those pictures were inserted largely for an emotional component of an engagement with us as professionals living with disabilities. And I think that is conveyed also in the text. So just kind of a real life struggle that we've been through. Okay. And it looks like Tyler has been conversing.
I wanted to get that one written in so that people can see it and copy it out if they want. We got a question, what would the best plugin or piece of software be to experience a screen reader? And I would strongly recommend NVDA by NV Access. It's an open source screen reader written in Python. It's available on GitHub. You can even contribute to it if you want to. It's free and available to use for everyone. It is industry standard. It's what a lot of us use here and what a lot of people in the community use. It's also a fantastic open point for beginners. The learning curve is very, very low. It's built to be intuitive and easy to understand. It's a great screen reader, and there's a comprehensive guide, both in text and interactive built into it. So it's really good for people who might not have a visual impairment or who might just not know where to start to try out.
Everybody is welcome to stay on and chat with Tyler. Unfortunately, and Ellen is here too. Unfortunately, I have another meeting, but it was great to see you all. We do have another ADA webinar coming up, I believe in April, that's not yet scheduled, on ADA web rules and social media. And Ellen will get a recording of this out to you. We also have recordings of our first webinar that on just the general ADA rules, focusing on determining if which documents need to be made accessible and which do not. That's on our YouTube channel. So thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. Tyler and Ellen will remain on.
Yep.